good example within maltreatment of something that's tight is sexual abuse, okay? Things like neglect, et cetera, the problem of maltreatment in general, those get a little bit more wicked. The beauty of tame problems is that they are often solvable by technical solutions, not easy solutions. I think yesterday's talks really suggested how complicated and technical school-based prevention work can be. But the fact is that we can identify a solution and work toward that. Wicked problems, on the other hand, defy pragmatics. And it's because the problem itself is complex. Typically, these kinds of problems are embedded in systems with very divergent aims, and perhaps most fundamentally, that there's contested normative and political stakeholders around these issues. And again, as we know here, wicked problems typically involve resource constraints. So my talking points today are to give you a selective overview, really from a bird's eye view of child maltreatment, child welfare system involvement. So some of the institutional issues in how we arrange child welfare services to children. I'm going to consider the child welfare system, educational system, and really child mental health system. All of these systems are implicated in these issues, and talk about their conflicting organizational logics. And then, in anticipation for our policy discussion later this afternoon, I'm going to propose some ways to begin to think of solutions from a wicked perspective. Okay, so first talking point one of the luxuries and the beauties of hearing the presentations yesterday is like I had to modify my slides 100 times because Carlo and I had chosen similar slides. But what I thought I could add today is really put the child welfare system in context a bit. Just a caveat, the experience of maltreatment actually is a common thread among many system-involved youth, and that's the child welfare, and I'm going to use system in quotes for reasons that will become obvious later, the juvenile justice system, which I will not talk about today, and the child mental health system. Oftentimes, your experience is going to differ depending on what system's threshold you cross first. Okay, so if you cross first into juvenile justice, you're going to have a different experience than if you cross into foster care, or if you cross into schools into one of these systems. We had a big discussion yesterday about prevention, and I wanted to add another caveat here that there really is concern that prevention systems do not work for the most marginalized and multi-stressed families. The weight of the evidence base, which has had its criticisms, is centered on families with some, not families with multiple challenges. And I want to just caution that the US itself is not the most family-friendly nation, policy-wise. So I guess I'm using the term families who can parent without support pretty loosely, okay? Carlos showed you this slide yesterday. What I just wanted to what it really basically shows is the pathways through the front end to the back end, or that's what child welfare folks call it, of this system. I believe Carlo made the one key point yesterday that all children who are maltreated are not going to necessarily be involved with that system, which means the system takes the report. And not all families that receive a report are going to get services or go into the system. So front end and back end. We talked a lot about the role of teachers in detection, but I wanted to also give you a warning that law enforcement professionals and medical professionals are the most likely, in relationship to educators, have much greater odds of getting reports substantiated. So a caveat to think about the role of educational professionals in detection and whether we think that should be the right detection logic. We talked yesterday about sexual abuse. By far, the predominant reason for substantiation is neglect, the very issues that you are talking that are more complex. Finally, a very, very small proportion of children referred will come child welfare system involved. And that system itself has its own dynamics. Yesterday we were talking about the developmental trajectories of kids. Children also have lifespans within these systems in terms of where they are placed, whether their placement changes, and whether and when they return home. And I think those are also salient transition points that have opportunities for intervention as well. Finally, maltreatment and child welfare system involvement are deeply rooted in structural conditions. And right now, there are very vexing concerns within the child welfare system about disproportionate representation of African American, particularly children in this system, across all the pipeline points. You saw these slides yesterday. I think extending the wicked problem is that we know that both maltreated children and children that enter foster care struggle in school. Okay, so talking point number 2 today is let's bring the systems themselves to the forefront so we can really surface their divergent aims and their contested political nature. As I mentioned, I'm going to consider child welfare, then our mental health system, and then finally education. I wanted to note that our child welfare system is not really a system per se. There are general federal mandates that child protection agencies must exist. They must adhere to a broad set of requirements, but this system is differentially administered at state and local levels. The policy press currently is that that system is going to focus on permanency for children, okay? Not necessarily well-being. And that in itself is a value issue where we are balancing parents' rights versus children's rights. So what we're going to typically try to do is have the youth remain at home with their parents if possible. And once they are removed, the goal is permanency, and I would say to some extent less so stability. Recent case child welfare-oriented policies as they are represented in law are really focused, again, this is just showing timely decisions to permanency when reunification isn't possible. I also want to note that child welfare law is not silent on education issues. Directives suggest that that part of child welfare systems should aim to improve educational stability and opportunities by thinking about or paying to placement decisions and school moves and how to optimize children's stability and school experience. But most legal advocates note that the provisions in the law are insufficient to ensure adequate accountability around educational outcomes. My take on this literature is that problems of coordination and collaboration are really formidable. When we think of how we can coordinate efforts between the child welfare system and other child systems of care, particularly education. Number one, I want to note that demands of families and caregivers involved in the child's welfare system are extremely formidable. What it takes to try to achieve permanency for your child, I don't think I could often adhere to some of the provisions outlined in case plans. We know that school mobility and placement changes often happen among children involved in the system. We know that FERPA requirements complicate record sharing. We know that children have unclear educational surrogacy once they enter the system. And we know that education is often not a priority when the focus of that system often ends up being on beds. Okay. In addition to academic difficulties, we also know that children with histories of maltreatment or foster care involvement are more likely to have identified mental health needs. And I want to point out again that we don't really have a child mental health system in this country. There have been long-standing issues in creating, sustaining, and authentically implementing mental health systems of care for children, given that there's tons of unmet need, and this unmet need is shaped by race and class. In fact, there's no question about it. Schools are the de facto mental health system for care for children, wherein about 80% of schools offer some services and 80% of services are delivered in schools. In some ways, parents like this. However, we talked yesterday that they are not really sufficiently engaged in school-based school delivery. This literature, and I hope you're going to see my theme, calls for coordinated and collaborative approaches that draw on the indigenous resources available at local school sites. Okay? So we heard collaboration, child welfare system, collaboration, children's mental health system. So I'll finally consider schools as systems. I want to present you all some truisms of schools. We'll see if Brian agrees with me that these institutional factors resonate. But I would argue that schools as an institution reflect dominant and conflicting social values. And we often, through the history of schooling, have had these priorities, or I'll give examples of waxing and waning between standards focus versus child or whole child approaches have happened since the advent of the common school. Another dynamic that's part of this is that schools end up being catch-alls for vexing issues. So I think we have an obesity crisis, call the schools. We don't have a child mental health system or a real response to poverty in this country, put it on the schools. That causes schools as institutions to buffer. And again, I think should be in the back of our minds when we suggest that we should push our work into schools, because schools historically resist those efforts. Schools were originally designed for enrollment and still retain that structure, which is often taken for granted. Our age grading of classrooms, the isolation of teachers within classrooms, the sequencing of curriculum have not changed very much and are not something we ever question very strongly. And they don't fit many students. Schools also are very good at sorting children. They reliably construct differences among children, which are often racialized, and that is often a sensitive point in service delivery. So that when we say you don't fit, it is typically, therefore, go out of the general education setting, which is a real problematic concern. And mental health services in schools often start taking this pattern where all of a sudden, all of the children of color are in school-based services, okay? Which again is like a tracking mechanisms in many ways. So we have to be very sensitive about our being complicit with those differences. Finally, although there's really good evidence about what well-functioning schools look like, this is schools with strong visionary leadership, places that really put student relationships and academic rigor in the forefront, schools that have coherent plans of staff development and aligned work. We know what they look like, but it's difficult to get there. And one of the difficulties has to do with this idea that classroom instruction is often isolated. Changing, and I guess the other lesson I would take from school reform is that it takes a laser focus on adults in school settings to get things done. Finally, I want to remind us that school-based service delivery is not a new thing. As a student of the history of school social work delivery, I have not seen very much new stuff over time. Community schools actually were developed by a principal at the turn of the century. You know, so I think some of our narrative yesterday about schools not being prepared for this work is not actually true to what we know historically about that pattern is. The problem is that services are often unevenly funded, and so they pop in and pop out over time. And they can get co-opted into sorting structures. There's beautiful histories about how very holistically child-oriented social workers end up as truancy officers all of a sudden. We also have a problem of service penetration in school, which is a bit of a double-edged sword. The typical dynamic is that powerful advocates come into schools and demand a response, whether it's oral health, the dentist demanded this, whether, I'm going to be provocative, it's trauma-informed schools is another way that powerful advocates are trying to push in. But then in exchange for integrating those services, those initiatives agree to leave instruction untouched, okay? And that is unfortunate because Brian just told us about how important teachers are in their relational work with kids. Unfortunately, my read of the mental health intervention literature is that mental health interventions well developed and delivered in schools do not have potent enough instructional levers to push meaningful academic growth, okay? So Carlo and Brian illustrated that it's both and. Services and support, rigor and support together. We've had a very hard time getting to that integration point. And I'll give you an example. I have done work on interventions in schools that are meant to push student attendance. And I will get for example, I'll get a great program effect of 5 days. And I'll be really happy because that effect size is much larger than that which is typically yielded in the literature. But the issue is that the kids that are typically subject to those interventions have absentee rates of 10 or more days. So while 5 is better than 10, 5 is still an awful lot. It's not going to close the gap. So I have been inspired by Weinstein and Bialis-White's recent review of what they are terming smart supports, which I believe you guys have actually provided an exemplar of, where it really starts to move beyond programs to process, or actually I would say it moves beyond programs and frameworks to processes and packaging. This framework reviews kind of all the school-embedded services literature and suggests that instead of thinking about programs, we think about whether programs help us achieve these 5 general principles, where the supports we provide students within a school are school-wide, strengths-focused, stigma-free, and laden with second chances. That these supports are multi-domain and multiculturally oriented. That supports are aligned together and aligned with instruction, but also are adaptable. That supports are strongly relationally oriented and responsive. You've heard perhaps narratives where we talk about not rigor first, but relationships first, then rigor, which happens also to be a feature of culturally responsive pedagogy, where we see the child before we push the child. And we can think about this from the perspective of teachers, as well as parents and caregivers. We can think this about relationships between teachers and parents, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, that these supports are timely and tiered. You guessed it. Building smart supports takes coordination and collaboration. I'm going to leave you with Nancy Roberts' suggestions about framing solutions, or how she thought we might think about framing solutions to wicked problems. And what's interesting, and perhaps this will come up in the policy talk this afternoon, her work was really thinking about problems that were that had power-contested relationships embedding them. And when I thought through this, I was like, would I really say that the child welfare system and the mental health system and the education system are in power relationships over dollars? I probably wouldn't say that necessarily. I'm not sure that some of maltreatment as a wicked problem has some of those same power dynamics. I would say that education, mental health, and child welfare are 3